The Tower of London wasn't built to hold prisoners. It was built to dismantle human beings, one scream at a time. But before we start, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you like these stories, and tell me in the comments where you are watching this from and what time it is for you. You'd be surprised of how many of us are here at the same time. Picture this, it's 1483, and you've just been dragged through the gates of the Tower of London. But this isn't the tourist attraction you know from postcards. This is a fortress designed to break human beings down to their component parts. Piece by piece, scream by scream. Congratulations. You're about to spend what might be your final night in one of the history's most efficient machines for destroying the human spirit. You think you understand fear? You think you know what darkness means? Try being locked in a stone chamber where prisoners have scratched their dying words into walls stained with centuries of blood and despair, where the air itself seems thick with the accumulated terror of everyone who entered before you and never left alive. The tower wasn't just a prison, it was a psychological weapon designed to crush your will long before the headsman's axe ever touched your neck. Every stone was placed, every corridor designed, every cell positioned to maximize human suffering while keeping you technically alive long enough to serve the Crown's purposes. You're not just facing one night, you're facing a concentrated dose of medieval horror that would make modern horror movies look like children's fairy tales. And here's the beautiful irony. Survival doesn't mean escaping. It means lasting until dawn with your sanity intact. Spoiler alert, you won't. So you've been processed through the tower's reception, and by processed, I mean stripped, searched, and shoved into what can only generously be called accommodation. Welcome to your new home, a stone box barely large enough for you to lie down. Assuming you don't mind your feet touching the wall, and your head scraping the opposite end. Medieval prison architects were brilliant at understanding exactly how much space a human being needs to survive, then providing about half that amount. Your cell isn't designed for comfort, it's designed to remind you constantly that you've been reduced from a human being to inventory. Expensive inventory that needs to be kept alive for now, but inventory nonetheless. The walls weep, not metaphorically. They literally weep moisture that's part condensation, part centuries of accumulated human misery, and part substances you don't want to identify. The floor is stone that's been worn smooth by the pacing of previous occupants, creating subtle grooves that tell the story of countless desperate souls wearing down rock with their restless desperation. There's no window. Why would there be? Windows are for people who have futures to look toward. You get whatever light trickles down from torches in the corridor, filtered through iron bars and the malicious indifference of guards who have learned to see prisoners as entertainment rather than human beings. Your bed is straw, not fresh straw. Straw that's been used by previous occupants and carries their scent, their diseases, and probably their parasites. The brilliant part is you'll be grateful for it. Within hours, those mouldy, probably disease-ridden clumps will feel like luxury because the alternative is bare stone that conducts cold into your bones like thermal quicksand. But here's the psychological masterpiece, the cell door. Massive oak reinforced with iron, designed not just to contain you, but to remind you audibly of your powerlessness. Every time it closes, the sound echoes through your bones. When guards walk past, their keys jangle with the specific musical note of your helplessness. Think you're alone in your stone box? How adorably naive. Meet your new roommates, the rats. Not the occasional mouse you might find in a modern basement. We're talking about medieval tower rats that have grown fat and bold on a steady diet of prisoner flesh, alive and dead. These aren't ordinary rats. These are descendants of generations that have lived exclusively in the tower, feeding on everything from bread scraps to human fingers. They've evolved into something that would make modern sewer rats look like timid house pets. They're not afraid of you. Why would they be? You're just another temporary resident in their permanent kingdom. The rats know things you don't. They know which prisoners are dying by scent alone. They know when guards are coming before you hear footsteps. They know which cells will be empty by morning, and they position themselves accordingly. They've developed a pack intelligence that treats human suffering as a dinner bell. You'll hear them first, scratching, scurrying, communicating in squeaks that sound disturbingly like whispered conversations. Then you'll see their eyes reflecting whatever dim light filters into your cell, watching you with the patience of predators who know you're already cornered. The smart ones wait until you fall asleep. That's when they get bold, when they start exploring whether you're weak enough to be considered food while you're still breathing. You'll wake to tiny claws on your skin and needle teeth testing whether you'll fight back effectively enough to be worth avoiding. But here's the real psychological horror. You'll start talking to them. Isolation does that to human minds. We'll form social bonds with anything that acknowledges our existence. Within hours, you'll be having conversations with rats, and the truly terrifying part is they'll seem to understand you better than the guards do. Welcome to the tower's atmospheric hell, where the very air has been weaponized against human survival. Every breath you take is a reminder that your body is slowly being poisoned by the environment designed to keep you alive just long enough to suffer properly. The air quality in medieval dungeons would violate every modern safety standard ever conceived. You're breathing a cocktail of mole spores, human waste particles, rotting organic matter, and the accumulated exhalations of countless prisoners who've slowly suffocated in these same spaces. The humidity creates perfect conditions for bacteria and fungal growth that turns each breath into a biological Russian roulette. Your lungs start burning within hours, not from physical exertion, from the simple act of trying to extract oxygen from air thick enough to taste. Medieval prisoners developed a distinctive cough that guards recognized as the beginning of the end. The desperate wet hacking of respiratory systems slowly drowning in their own inflammatory responses. The smell is psychological warfare. Human waste, rotting food, unwashed bodies, infected wounds, and the sweet, sick scent of approaching death, all marinated together in stone chambers that never fully air out. Your nose will try to adjust, but medieval prison air is specifically designed to overwhelm human adaptation mechanisms. But here's the beautiful torture. You can't stop breathing. Every survival instinct screams at you to get fresh air, but there isn't any. Your body's most basic need becomes a source of constant suffering. You'll find yourself taking shallow breaths, trying to minimize exposure to the toxic atmosphere, but that just leads to lightheadedness and panic. The panic feeds on itself. Short breaths trigger anxiety responses that make you want to breathe deeper, which exposes you to more toxic air, which increases panic, which makes breathing even more difficult. It's a perfectly designed spiral of biological terror that uses your own survival mechanisms against you. Think silence would be mercy. The tower's acoustic environment was specifically designed to ensure that silence would be the least of your worries. Welcome to a 24-hour symphony of human suffering that makes modern noise torture look amateur. The echoes are mathematical precision instruments of psychological warfare. Stone corridors and chambers amplify and distort every sound, creating an endless feedback loop of audio horror. Screams from other prisoners don't just reach your cell, they bounce off walls, multiply, and arrive from multiple directions simultaneously, making it impossible to locate their source or know how close danger might be. Guard patrols become psychological terrorism. Heavy boots on stone create rhythmic intimidation that announces their approach while keeping you guessing about their intentions. Will they stop at your cell? Are they coming for you? That metallic jangle of keys becomes a Pavlovian torture device that triggers fight or flight responses every single time. Other prisoners provide the worst sounds: crying, pleading, praying, cursing, and eventually the wet, desperate sounds of people whose bodies are shutting down. You'll hear conversations that aren't conversations. the rambling, disconnected voices of minds that have snapped under pressure, talking to walls, dead relatives, or imaginary audiences. The truly diabolical sounds are the subtle ones, dripping water that measures time in geological patience. Scratching that could be rats, or other prisoners trying to claw their way through stone or something worse. Whispers that might be wind through cracks, or guards planning your fate, or the voices of previous occupants who died in your exact cell. But the sound that will break you is your own voice. You'll start talking to yourself for comfort, then realise you're doing it, then try to stop, then break down and start again. Eventually, you'll be having full conversations with yourself, and the distinction between your voice and the other voices in the darkness will blur until you can't tell which thoughts are yours anymore. Medieval darkness isn't just the absence of light, it's a living thing that crawls inside your mind and starts rearranging the furniture. The tower's darkness has substance, weight, and malicious intelligence developed over centuries of swallowing human hope. Total darkness does things to human brains that medieval torturers understood long before modern psychology explained them. Your visual cortex, desperate for stimulation, starts generating its own images. These aren't gentle hallucinations. They're vivid, terrifying manifestations of every fear your subconscious has been suppressing. You'll see things moving in the darkness that your rational mind knows can't be there. Shapes that resolve into faces, then dissolve when you try to focus on them. Shadows that move independently of any light source. Your peripheral vision becomes a source of constant terror as your brain creates threats to explain the overwhelming sense of danger your environment generates. The darkness amplifies every other sense to unbearable intensity. That distant dripping becomes thunderous. Your heartbeat sounds like war drums. The scratch of rat claws becomes footsteps of approaching executioners. Your own breathing becomes so loud you're convinced guards can hear it from corridors away. Medieval prisoners developed a condition guards called dark madness, the complete breakdown of rational thought that comes from extended exposure to total darkness. You start seeing light that isn't there, hearing voices from the walls, feeling touches from invisible hands. Your brain, desperate to make sense of sensory deprivation, creates an entire alternate reality that feels more real than reality. But here's the cruelest part. Occasional light becomes torture rather than relief. When guards bring torches, the sudden illumination burns your dark, adapted eyes and reveals the true horror of your surroundings. You see the stains on the walls, the bones in the corners, the evidence of previous occupants' final moments. Darkness starts feeling like protection rather than punishment. Medieval cold isn't just uncomfortable, it's a patient assassin that kills you 1 degree at a time, while keeping you conscious enough to experience every stage of your body's surrender. Tower cells were designed to maintain temperatures just above lethal levels. Too cold, and prisoners died too quickly to serve the Crown's purposes. Not cold enough, and they might retain enough physical strength to cause problems. Medieval engineers achieved perfect temperatures for maximum suffering, cold enough to damage your body gradually, but warm enough to prevent immediate death. Your body heat becomes a limited resource that you'll calculate like currency. Every movement generates warmth, but uses energy you can't replace. Every breath steams in the frigid air, showing you exactly how much life force you're exhaling into the void. Your extremities start going numb first. Fingers, toes, ears, creating a creeping sensation of your body abandoning itself piece by piece. Medieval prisoners developed hypothermia in stages that guards learned to recognize. First came the uncontrollable shivering that wasted energy while providing no real warmth. Then the paradoxical undressing, where freezing brains convinced dying prisoners they were overheating. Finally, the fatal sleepiness that felt like mercy but was actually brain death approaching. The stone walls and floors act as thermal vampires, sucking heat from your body faster than you can generate it. Lying down means losing body heat to massive stone masses that have been cold for centuries and will remain cold long after you're dead. Standing means burning calories you don't have while still losing heat to the air. But here's the psychological masterpiece. You'll start hallucinating warmth. Your dying brain will create sensations of heat, visions of fires, memories of summer days that feel so real you'll strip off whatever clothing you have. Guards found frozen prisoners who died smiling, convinced they were basking in tropical sunshine, while ice formed in their veins. Think shared suffering creates solidarity. Medieval prison architects understood that desperate humans become more dangerous to each other than any external threat. Your fellow prisoners aren't potential allies. Their competition for resources so limited that survival becomes a zero-sum game. The tower housed a careful mix of prisoner types designed to maximize psychological pressure. Political prisoners with everything to lose, common criminals with nothing left to lose, religious heretics convinced they're martyrs, and the occasional lunatic whose presence reminded everyone how thin the line between sanity and madness really was. Food distribution was psychological warfare, not enough for everyone, distributed irregularly with no clear rules about who gets what when. Prisoners learned to guard their meagre rations like wild animals, creating a social dynamic where every interaction carried the potential for violence over bread scraps that wouldn't feed a modern house cat. The truly dangerous prisoners were the veterans, long-term occupants who'd adapted to tower life by abandoning human morality entirely. They'd learned which guards could be bribed, which newcomers could be exploited, and which survival strategies required other prisoners to die. They'd trade information about escape attempts for extra food, sell protection services for sexual favours, and eliminate potential threats with the efficient brutality of predators. But the most terrifying fellow prisoners were the ones who had embraced their fate. These weren't broken people. They were people who had found peace in hopelessness and developed a missionary zeal for convincing others that resistance was futile. They'd whisper stories of failed escapes, describe execution methods in loving detail, and explain why accepting death was easier than clinging to impossible hope. You'll find yourself calculating which prisoners pose immediate threats versus long-term dangers. The weeping newcomer might be planning to trade your escape plans for leniency. The quiet veteran might be sizing you up for elimination. The religious fanatic might decide your death would serve God's will. Everyone becomes simultaneously potential ally and certain enemy. Meet the tower guards, men who have turned human suffering into entertainment and prisoner degradation into professional expertise. These aren't just jailers, they're artists whose medium is despair and whose masterpiece is your psychological destruction. Medieval guard recruitment favoured men who'd already demonstrated comfort with violence and indifference to human suffering. Veterans of brutal campaigns, criminals who'd bargained military service for pardons, and sociopaths who'd found their calling in positions that rewarded cruelty. The Tower Guard Corps represented the absolute worst of medieval society given official authority and encouraged to exercise it creatively. Guards developed elaborate games around prisoner suffering, betting pools on who would break first, who would attempt suicide, who would start hallucinating. They'd stage fake executions to trigger psychological breakdowns. Then laugh about prisoners who begged for mercy that was never coming. Your terror was their entertainment, your despair their daily amusement. The truly sadistic guards understood psychological torture better than physical brutality. They'd describe your family's fate in loving detail, whether true or not. They'd read letters from loved ones, then burn them before your eyes. They'd bring news of your property being confiscated, your reputation destroyed, your name becoming synonymous with treason or heresy. But here's the beautiful psychological trap. Some guards would show occasional kindness. An extra piece of bread, a moment of conversation, a brief acknowledgement of your humanity. This wasn't mercy. It was calculated manipulation designed to make you grateful for basic human decency, dependent on their approval, and hopeful enough to avoid the despair that might drive you to suicide before serving the Crown's purposes. The worst guards were the ones who'd started as decent men and gradually adapted to tower culture. Watching them transition from uncomfortable with prisoner suffering to actively enjoying it provided a real-time demonstration of how environments can corrupt human nature. You'd see your own potential future reflected in their eyes. The possibility that enough exposure to this place might turn you into something equally monstrous. Here's the final, crushing reality that makes survival impossible. Dawn in the tower doesn't mean rescue. It means your night of horror was just the appetizer before the main course of your destruction. Morning brings new tortures disguised as bureaucracy. Interrogations that make the night's psychological warfare look gentle. Formal reading of charges that catalogue every reason why hope is mathematically impossible. Legal proceedings that maintain the fiction of justice while ensuring predetermined outcomes. The sunrise you've been praying for reveals the true horror of your surroundings in merciless detail. Bloodstains that look like shadows in darkness. Scratch marks in stone made by fingernails of previous prisoners. Bones in corners that belong to people who had families, hopes, and dreams just like yours. The morning light doesn't bring hope. It brings the visual confirmation that hope was always an illusion. Other prisoners who seemed human in darkness reveal themselves as broken shells in daylight. You see the madness in their eyes, the physical deterioration, the spiritual damage that turns people into walking warnings about what you're becoming. Morning doesn't bring salvation. It brings previews of your own inevitable transformation. But here's the ultimate psychological torture. Morning means you survive the night, which means you'll face another night, and another, each one slightly worse as your body weakens, your mind fragments, and your spirit accepts what your rational thoughts still refuse to believe. The tower's true genius wasn't killing prisoners quickly. It was keeping them alive long enough to become willing participants in their own destruction. Morning meant another day of watching yourself disappear, piece by piece, until execution felt like mercy rather than punishment. You came into the tower as a human being with rights, dignity, and hope. You won't survive the night because survival requires remaining human, and the tower was specifically designed to make that impossible. Medieval engineers understood something modern humanity prefers to forget. Human beings aren't as resilient as we think. Human dignity isn't as permanent as we assume. And the line between civilization and savagery is much thinner than any of us want to admit. So the next time you visit the Tower of London as a tourist, remember, you're not looking at history, you're looking at a perfectly preserved machine for breaking human beings. And that machine is still there, still waiting, still ready to demonstrate exactly how fragile everything you think you know about yourself really is. The only real question isn't whether you'd survive a night in the Tower of London. The question is, what aspects of your comfortable modern life are just more sophisticated versions of the same machine? Human nature hasn't changed. We've just gotten better at building prettier prisons. The Great Library of Alexandria. That legendary temple of knowledge that supposedly held every book, scroll, and secret the ancient world had to offer. Hollywood loves to paint it as this mystical repository where scholars wandered marble halls surrounded by infinite wisdom. The reality, it was both more incredible and more tragic than any movie could capture. The Library of Alexandria wasn't just destroyed once. It died 1,000 deaths, each one more devastating than the last. And by the time we're done tonight, you'll understand why its loss still haunts us today. The story begins with a man who never saw the library built, but dreamed it into existence. Alexander the Great. When Alexander conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, he didn't just want another trophy city. He wanted to create something that would outlast his empire, a centre of learning that would gather all human knowledge under one roof. Alexander died young, as conquerors often do, but his dream lived on through one of his generals, Ptolemy I. Ptolemy wasn't just a soldier, he was a scholar who understood that true power didn't just come from armies, it came from ideas. When he established the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, he made Alexandria not just his capital, but his intellectual masterpiece. The library wasn't built overnight. It started around 295 BC under Ptolemy I and was expanded by his successors. But this wasn't just some ancient bookstore. The Ptolemies had a vision that was breathtakingly ambitious. They wanted to collect every piece of written knowledge in the world. Every single piece. Think about that for a moment. In an age when books were hand-copied, when knowledge was scattered across dozens of civilizations, when simply travelling from one city to another could take months, the Ptolemies decided they would gather it all. Greek philosophy, Egyptian mathematics, Babylonian astronomy, Jewish theology, Persian poetry, Indian medicine. If it was written down, they wanted it in Alexandria. And they weren't polite about it. Ships entering Alexandria's harbour were searched. Any scrolls found were confiscated, copied, and the originals kept for the library. The owners got the copies back. This wasn't borrowing, this was intellectual imperialism. But it worked. The library wasn't a single building. It was a complex called the Museion, the Shrine of the Muses, that included lecture halls, laboratories, astronomical observatories, botanical gardens, and a zoo. It was the world's first university, research institute, and think tank, all rolled into one magnificent institution. At its peak, the library supposedly held between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. But remember, ancient scrolls weren't like modern books. A single work might require multiple scrolls. The Iliad and Odyssey together would have taken up dozens. So we're talking about tens of thousands of different works from across the known world. The Ptolemies didn't just collect randomly, they were systematic. They hired scholars not just to read and teach, but to actively seek out texts. They sent agents across the Mediterranean world with one mission: find knowledge and bring it back. They paid premium prices for rare works. They sponsored expeditions to far-off lands just to access their libraries. But here's what made Alexandria truly special. It wasn't just about hoarding scrolls. The Ptolemies created an environment where knowledge could grow. They provided stipends to scholars. They encouraged research. They facilitated debates between different schools of thought. For the first time in human history, you had brilliant minds from different cultures and traditions, all working together in one place. The library was a machine for creating knowledge as much as preserving it. And for nearly 3 centuries, it worked beyond anyone's wildest dreams. Picture this. You're a scholar in the 3rd century BCE, and you've just received an invitation to join the Library of Alexandria. You're not just getting access to books, you're entering the intellectual equivalent of Olympus. The scholars who worked at the library weren't just librarians, they were the leading lights of their age. Euclid developed his geometric principles here. The same Euclid whose mathematical laws we still teach in schools today worked in these halls. Archimedes spent time here, probably bouncing ideas off other brilliant minds. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with stunning accuracy, using nothing but shadows and mathematics. But it wasn't just Greek scholars. The Ptolemies were smart enough to realise that knowledge doesn't respect cultural boundaries. Jewish scholars translated their sacred texts here, creating the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible that would influence Christianity for centuries. Egyptian priests shared their ancient wisdom about medicine, astronomy, and engineering. Babylonian mathematicians brought their sophisticated understanding of numbers and celestial mechanics. The library had sections dedicated to every field of knowledge: medicine, mathematics, astronomy, geography, literature, philosophy, history, and subjects we can't even imagine because they have been lost to time. Scholars had access to medical texts that described surgical procedures we didn't rediscover until the Renaissance. They had astronomical observations that tracked planetary movements with remarkable precision. They had geographical works that mapped trade routes across 3 continents. And here's the beautiful part. It was all connected. A mathematician could walk down the hall and discuss his work with a physician. An astronomer could collaborate with a geographer to understand how the Earth moved through space. A philosopher could test his theories against the practical knowledge of engineers and inventors. The library sponsored research expeditions. They sent scholars to measure the Earth, map the stars, catalogue plants and animals, and study foreign cultures. They weren't just collecting passive knowledge, they were actively expanding the boundaries of human understanding. Some of the most groundbreaking work happened here. Hero of Alexandria invented the steam engine. Yes, the steam engine, 18 centuries before the Industrial Revolution. Apollonius developed mathematical theories about conic sections that wouldn't be fully appreciated until the space age. Aristarchus proposed that the Earth orbited the Sun almost 2,000 years before Copernicus. The library also became a centre for literary preservation and criticism. Scholars here developed the principles of textual analysis that we still use today. They compared different versions of works, identified corruptions in copying, and tried to establish authentic texts. They wrote commentaries that helped preserve not just the words of ancient authors, but their meanings and contexts. But perhaps most importantly, the library represented an ideal that had never existed before, the belief that all knowledge was valuable, that different cultures and traditions had something to contribute, and that understanding the world was a goal worth pursuing for its own sake. For nearly 3 centuries, Alexandria was the undisputed intellectual capital of the world. Students came from across the Mediterranean to study here. Rulers sent their sons to be educated in its halls. When you wanted to know something, anything, Alexandria was where you went. It was humanity's greatest attempt to gather all knowledge in one place, and for a brief shining moment in history, it actually worked. But nothing that bright can burn forever without attracting the attention of those who prefer darkness. The first real threats to the library came not from ignorant barbarians, but from the very civilization that created it. By the 2nd century BCE, the Ptolemaic dynasty was weakening. The later Ptolemies were more interested in palace intrigue than intellectual pursuits. They stopped funding expeditions, reduced stipends for scholars, and began to see the library more as a symbol of prestige than a centre of learning. Rome was rising, and Roman attitudes toward Greek learning were complicated. On one hand, educated Romans respected Greek scholarship and culture, but on the other hand, they viewed it with suspicion. Too much thinking, they believed, could make people question authority. Too much foreign learning might corrupt Roman values. When Rome finally absorbed Egypt in 30 BCE, after the deaths of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, the library's fate was sealed. Oh, it didn't disappear immediately. The Romans were too smart for that. They understood the library's value, but they also began to change its character. The Romans were practical people. They were interested in knowledge that had immediate applications: engineering, medicine, military tactics, administration. The more abstract pursuits that had flourished under the Ptolemies, pure mathematics, theoretical astronomy, philosophical speculation, began to seem less important. Funding was reduced. The best scholars were recruited to work in Rome itself rather than Alexandria. The library's collection stopped growing. Worse, the Romans began to be selective about what knowledge they preserved. Works that seemed politically dangerous or religiously questionable were quietly removed or allowed to decay. The library also faced a more subtle threat: competition. Rome established libraries in the capital. Athens maintained its own scholarly institutions. Other cities began to build their own collections. Alexandria was no longer the only game in town. But the real killer was the changing intellectual climate. The Hellenistic period had been marked by curiosity, experimentation, and a willingness to question traditional beliefs. The Roman period brought more rigid thinking, more emphasis on authority and tradition, less tolerance for ideas that challenged established order. The scholars who worked at the library during this period often found themselves walking a tightrope. They could pursue knowledge, but only certain kinds of knowledge. They could ask questions, but not too many questions. They could preserve ancient wisdom, but they had to be careful about which wisdom they preserved and which they let slip away. The library was still there, still impressive, still valuable, but it was no longer the dynamic, growing institution it had once been. It was becoming a museum rather than a laboratory. And museums, however grand, are where living things go to die. The decline wasn't dramatic. It was gradual, bureaucratic, almost invisible, but it was inexorable. The light that had burned so brightly for 3 centuries was beginning to dim. The rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire brought a new kind of threat to the library, one that would prove far more devastating than Roman pragmatism or political decline. This wasn't just about changing priorities or reduce funding. This was about whether certain kinds of knowledge should exist at all. Early Christianity had a complicated relationship with classical learning. Some church fathers, like Augustine, argued that pagan knowledge could be useful if properly subordinated to Christian truth. Others, like Tertullian, famously asked, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" Meaning, what use did Christians have for Greek philosophy and science? By the 4th century CE, as Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, these tensions came to a head. The library, with its vast collection of pagan texts, its celebration of pre-Christian learning, and its tradition of free inquiry, represented everything that militant Christians found threatening. The most dramatic confrontation came in 391 CA under Emperor Theodosius I. Christian mobs led by Archbishop Theophilus of Alexandria attacked pagan temples throughout the city. The Serapeum, which housed part of the library's collection, was destroyed. Thousands of scrolls went up in flames. This wasn't random violence. It was systematic destruction based on religious ideology. The Christians weren't just opposed to pagan worship, they were opposed to pagan knowledge. Medical texts that referred to Greek gods were burned. Astronomical works that suggested the universe operated according to natural laws rather than divine will were destroyed. Philosophical treatises that questioned religious authority were eliminated. The destruction was often justified in religious terms. These books, the Christians argued, contained dangerous ideas that could lead people away from true faith. Better to destroy them than risk souls being corrupted by pagan wisdom. But it wasn't just about theology. It was about power. The old classical learning represented an alternative source of authority. If people could understand the natural world through observation and reason, if they could develop ethical systems through philosophical inquiry, if they could find meaning in literature and poetry, what need did they have for religious authority? The attack on the library was part of a broader assault on classical culture. Pagan schools were closed, non-Christian teachers were banned, ancient festivals and ceremonies were outlawed. The very language of classical learning, with its references to gods and myths and philosophical concepts, was being systematically purged. Some scholars tried to preserve what they could. They hid manuscripts, copied important works in secret, or tried to present classical learning in terms acceptable to Christian authorities. But it was a losing battle. For every text they saved, dozens were lost. The irony is bitter. Christianity, which would later become a major force for literacy and learning, began by destroying one of the greatest centres of knowledge the world had ever seen. The religion that would eventually build universities and libraries and schools started by burning books. Not all Christians supported this destruction. Many were horrified by it, but the extremists had political power, and they used it ruthlessly. By the end of the 4th century, the great library of Alexandria was effectively dead. Some remnants survived into the 5th and 6th centuries, but it was a shadow of its former self. The Christian Revolution didn't just destroy books, it destroyed an entire way of thinking about knowledge. The idea that truth could be discovered through inquiry, that different traditions might have valuable insights, that knowledge was worth pursuing for its own sake. It would take centuries for that spirit to be reborn. After the Christian destructions of the 4th century, what remained of the great library limped along for another few centuries, but its fate was sealed by a series of final catastrophes that would erase even the memory of what it had once been. The Persian conquest of Alexandria in 619 CE dealt another devastating blow. The Sassanid Persians weren't particularly interested in preserving Greek learning. What manuscripts survived the Christian purges were now vulnerable to simple neglect and decay. Without funding, without scholars to maintain them, without anyone who cared about their preservation, countless scrolls simply crumbled to dust. But the most controversial and debated destruction came with the Arab conquest of Alexandria in 641 CE. According to some later Islamic sources, Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab ordered the remaining books to be burned, allegedly saying, "If these writings agree with the Quran, they are superfluous. If they disagree, they are dangerous." Whether this story is true remains hotly debated by historians. Many scholars believe it's a later fabrication, possibly created by Christian chroniclers to paint the Muslim conquerors in a negative light. The early Islamic empire was generally respectful of learning and scholarship. Muslim rulers in places like Baghdad and Cordoba would later become great patrons of knowledge, preserving and translating many classical works that might otherwise have been lost. But true or not, the story reveals something important about how knowledge was increasingly seen in the post-classical world. Books weren't just repositories of information, they were weapons in religious and political conflicts. Libraries weren't neutral institutions, they were symbols of particular civilizations and belief systems. The reality is that by 641 CE, there probably wasn't much left to destroy anyway. The great collection that had once made Alexandria the intellectual centre of the world had been dying by inches for centuries. Political upheavals, religious conflicts, economic decline, and simple neglect had done their work. Perhaps the saddest part is how quickly the memory faded. Within a few generations, people began to forget that the library had ever existed. The stories that survived became increasingly mythical and exaggerated. Some writers claimed the library had contained millions of books. Others said it held every piece of knowledge in the universe. Still others invented dramatic stories about its destruction that bore little resemblance to the messy, complicated reality. The true tragedy wasn't just that the books were lost, it was that the very idea they represented, the belief that knowledge could transcend cultural and religious boundaries, that human curiosity was valuable in itself, that understanding the world was a goal worth pursuing, regardless of its practical applications, nearly died with them. By the time the library was completely gone, Europe was entering what we now call the Dark Ages. The Islamic world would preserve and expand upon some classical learning, but in different contexts and with different priorities. It would take centuries for anything resembling the Library of Alexandria's vision to emerge again. The last scholars to work in what remained of the library simply disappeared from history. No dramatic final stand, no heroic last effort to save the books. They just faded away, taking with them not just their knowledge, but their understanding of what knowledge could be. When we talk about the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, we're not just talking about the loss of books. We're talking about the loss of entire civilizations' worth of knowledge, ideas, and human achievement. The scale of what vanished is almost impossible to comprehend. Consider the works we know existed, but can no longer read. Sophocles wrote over 120 plays. We have only 7 complete works. Aeschylus wrote more than 90 plays. Only 7 survive. These weren't minor works by forgotten authors. These were masterpieces by writers considered among the greatest who ever lived. The library contained complete collections of their works, along with contemporary commentaries that helped explain their meaning and context. But it wasn't just literature. The library contained scientific works that wouldn't be rediscovered for over 1,000 years. Aristarchus of Samos had proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system 1,800 years before Copernicus. Hero of Alexandria had designed steam engines, programmable machines, and sophisticated mechanical devices that anticipated later inventions by centuries. Eratosthenes had calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy using purely mathematical methods. The mathematical works were particularly devastating to lose. The Greeks had developed sophisticated number theory, geometric proofs, and algebraic concepts that weren't rediscovered until the Renaissance or later. Apollonius's work on conic sections was so advanced that it wasn't fully understood until the development of analytic geometry in the 17th century. Medical knowledge, too, was set back by centuries. Ancient physicians had developed surgical techniques, pharmaceutical preparations, and diagnostic methods that were lost for generations. The library contained medical texts from Egypt, Greece, India, and Mesopotamia, a truly global collection of healing knowledge that took humanity centuries to rebuild. But perhaps the most significant loss was historical. Ancient historians had access to records, documents, and eyewitness accounts that no longer exist. They could consult Egyptian king lists going back thousands of years, Persian court records, detailed accounts of Alexander's campaigns written by people who were actually there. When their works were destroyed, we lost not just their interpretations, but the primary sources they drew upon. The library also contained works in languages that became extinct: Etruscan literature, Thracian poetry, early Germanic oral traditions that had been written down, all vanished without a trace. We lost not just individual works, but entire literary traditions. And here's what makes it even more tragic. Much of this knowledge was unique. The library's collection policies meant that many works existed nowhere else. When Alexandria's copies were destroyed, they were gone forever. No backup library in Rome or Athens contained duplicates because Alexandria had made sure to acquire the originals. The destruction created dark ages that lasted for centuries. European mathematics remained primitive until Arabic numerals were reintroduced from the Islamic world. Medicine relied on superstition and folk remedies, rather than systematic observation. Astronomy couldn't predict eclipses or planetary movements with any accuracy. Geography was filled with imaginary monsters and impossible landscapes. We often talk about scientific and cultural progress as inevitable, but the destruction of Alexandria proves otherwise. Human knowledge isn't a treasure that automatically accumulates over time. It's fragile, vulnerable, and can disappear as quickly as it was created. The Renaissance wasn't just about new discoveries, it was about painstakingly reconstructing knowledge that had been lost for 1,000 years. When scholars in the 15th and 16th centuries rediscovered classical texts through Arabic translations or Byzantine manuscripts, they weren't moving forward, they were catching up to where humanity had been a millennium earlier. That's the true cost of Alexandria's destruction. Not just what we lost, but the centuries of progress that had to be repeated, the discoveries that had to be made again, the human potential that was wasted rebuilding knowledge that should never have been forgotten in the first place. Even though the Library of Alexandria has been gone for over a millennium, scholars haven't given up hope of recovering fragments of its lost treasures. in monastery libraries, private collections, and archaeological sites around the Mediterranean, pieces of the great collection continue to surface like messages in bottles from a vanished civilization. The most dramatic discoveries have come from the most unexpected places. In 1906, archaeologists working at Oxyrhynchus, an ancient Egyptian town, began uncovering a massive garbage dump that turned out to be one of the greatest literary finds in history. Buried in the trash were thousands of papyrus fragments containing works by lost classical authors. Plays by Sophocles and Euripides that no one had read for over 1,000 years suddenly emerged from the sand. These weren't pristine library copies. They were fragments, scraps, damaged pieces. But for scholars, finding even a few lines of a lost work is like discovering treasure. Each fragment provides clues about works that might have been preserved in Alexandria. Each scrap of papyrus is a tiny window into the vanished world of classical literature. Monastery libraries have provided another source of hope. Medieval monks often recycled expensive parchment by scraping off old text and writing new material over it. These recycled manuscripts are called palimpsests, and using modern imaging techniques, scholars can sometimes read the original text underneath the medieval writing. Some of the most important classical works have been recovered this way, including portions of works that definitely would have been in the Alexandria collection. The Vatican Library, the Monastery of St. Catherine in Egypt, and various libraries in Constantinople have all yielded classical manuscripts that survived by accident or through the dedication of individual scholars who saved them from destruction. Each discovery raises the tantalizing possibility that more might be found. But the search isn't just about physical manuscripts. Scholars also work as literary detectives, trying to reconstruct lost works from quotations and references in surviving texts. Ancient authors often quoted earlier writers, sometimes extensively. By collecting these quotations and references, modern scholars can sometimes piece together substantial portions of lost works. This work requires incredible patience and expertise. Scholars must identify authentic quotations, distinguish them from paraphrases or misrememberings, and try to understand them in their original context. It's like trying to reconstruct a symphony from fragments preserved in other composers' works. Digital technology has revolutionized this search. Databases now allow scholars to search through thousands of surviving texts for quotations from lost authors. Advanced imaging techniques can reveal text on damaged papyri that would have been unreadable just decades ago. Computer algorithms help identify patterns and connections that human scholars might miss. Perhaps most excitingly, underwater archaeology has begun to explore the sunken portions of ancient Alexandria. The ancient city's harbour district is now underwater due to earthquakes and subsidence, but archaeologists have discovered statues, buildings, and other artifacts that might provide clues about the library's contents and organisation. Each discovery, no matter how small, adds to our understanding of what was lost. A fragment of an astronomical treatise shows us how sophisticated ancient mathematics really was. A scrap of a medical text reveals surgical techniques that weren't rediscovered until the modern era. A few lines of poetry give us a glimpse of literary traditions that vanished completely. The search continues because scholars understand that the Library of Alexandria represents more than just a collection of ancient books. It represents the ideal of universal knowledge, the belief that human understanding could transcend cultural and political boundaries. Every fragment recovered is a victory not just for scholarship, but for that ideal. But the hunt also serves as a reminder of how much we've lost, and how fragile our own accumulated knowledge really is. In an age of digital preservation and global communications, it's easy to assume that important information can never really disappear. The ghostly presence of Alexandria's lost treasures suggests otherwise. The library may be gone, But its shadows still haunt every library, every university, every attempt to gather and preserve human knowledge. And as long as scholars continue to search for its fragments, the dream it represented remains alive. The story of the Library of Alexandria isn't just ancient history, it's a cautionary tale that speaks directly to our modern world. In an age of digital information, political polarization, and cultural conflict, the lessons from Alexandria's rise and fall are more relevant than ever. First and most obviously, the story teaches us that knowledge is fragile. We often assume that once information is discovered or created, it becomes part of humanity's permanent inheritance. But Alexandria proves that's not true. Knowledge can be lost, forgotten, or deliberately destroyed. Progress isn't inevitable. It requires constant effort to maintain and protect. This lesson has particular urgency in our digital age. We store vast amounts of information in formats that may become unreadable within decades. We rely on technologies that could fail catastrophically. We've created systems where crucial knowledge exists only in the minds of a few specialists who could take it with them when they die or retire. The destruction of Alexandria also shows us how easily political and religious extremism can turn against learning itself. The Christians who burned the library's books weren't ignorant barbarians. They were educated people who had convinced themselves that certain kinds of knowledge were dangerous. They destroyed books not out of hatred for learning, but because they believed they were protecting society from harmful ideas. This pattern repeats throughout history. Nazi book burnings, Stalinist purges of intellectuals, the Taliban's destruction of cultural artifacts, all follow the same logic that led to Alexandria's destruction. When ideology becomes more important than truth, when political or religious authorities decide that knowledge itself is a threat, libraries and scholars become targets. But Alexandria's story also teaches us about the positive power of diversity and openness. The library succeeded because it welcomed knowledge from all cultures and traditions. Egyptian mathematics, Jewish theology, Greek philosophy, Babylonian astronomy, all were considered valuable. The synthesis of different intellectual traditions produced innovations that none could have achieved alone. In our increasingly connected but also increasingly polarized world, this lesson is crucial. The greatest challenges we face, climate change, disease, poverty, technological disruption, require knowledge and perspectives from multiple cultures and disciplines. No single tradition or nation has all the answers. The library's decline also shows us the importance of institutional support for learning. The Ptolemies didn't just collect books, they created an environment where knowledge could grow. They funded research, encouraged debate, and supported scholars who weren't immediately useful. When that support disappeared, the library died even before its books were burned. Today, we face similar challenges. Universities struggle with funding. Basic research is often neglected in favour of immediately profitable applications. Long-term thinking is sacrificed for short-term results. The infrastructure that supports learning and discovery requires constant investment and protection. Perhaps most importantly, Alexandria reminds us that knowledge and culture are not luxury goods. They're essential to human survival and progress. The library wasn't just a repository of interesting facts. It was a machine for solving problems, understanding the world, and improving human life. When it was destroyed, humanity didn't just lose books, it lost centuries of potential progress. But the story isn't entirely depressing. Alexandria's vision lived on even after the library died. Islamic scholars preserved and expanded upon classical learning. Medieval European universities rediscovered ancient texts. Renaissance humanists rebuilt the connections between different intellectual traditions. The dream of universal knowledge, of learning without boundaries, proved stronger than any attempt to destroy it. Today, we have opportunities that the ancient Alexandrians could never have imagined. Digital technology allows us to preserve and share information on an unprecedented scale. Global communications lets scholars collaborate across continents and cultures. We have the tools to build something even greater than the Library of Alexandria. But we also have the same human weaknesses that led to its destruction. The tendency toward extremism, the fear of different ideas, the temptation to prioritize short-term politics over long-term knowledge. Whether we create a new Alexandria or repeat its tragedy depends on the choices we make today. The library's ghost still haunts every attempt to gather and preserve human knowledge. Its shadow falls across every library, every university, every database. And its lost treasures remind us that knowledge once destroyed may be gone forever, but its vision, the belief that human understanding can transcend all boundaries, that truth is worth pursuing for its own sake, that knowledge belongs to all humanity. That vision burns as brightly today as it did over 2,000 years ago on the shores of the Mediterranean. The physical library of Alexandria is gone, reduced to dust and distant memory. But something remarkable happened. The idea of Alexandria proved immortal. Like a phoenix rising from intellectual ashes, the vision of a universal library has been reborn again and again throughout human history, each time adapted to new technologies and circumstances, but always carrying the same fundamental dream. Medieval Islamic scholars created the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, gathering texts from across the known world and translating them into Arabic. They preserved not just the works themselves, but the Alexandrian spirit of intellectual curiosity and cross-cultural learning. When European crusaders encountered these libraries, they carried that vision back to a continent that had largely forgotten it. The Renaissance humanists who rediscovered classical texts weren't just recovering old books, they were rebuilding Alexandria's vision of knowledge without boundaries. When they established universities and academies, when they corresponded with scholars across Europe, when they insisted that learning was a universal human heritage, they were channeling the same spirit that had once filled the halls of the Museion. The great national libraries that emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries, the British Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the Library of Congress, all consciously modelled themselves on Alexandria. They aimed to collect not just their own national literatures, but the written heritage of all humanity. They saw themselves as custodians of universal knowledge. And today, we're building the greatest Alexandria in human history, and most of us don't even realise it. The internet, with all its chaos and contradictions, represents the most ambitious attempt ever made to gather all human knowledge in one place. Wikipedia alone contains more information than the original Library of Alexandria could have dreamed of holding. But the digital Alexandria faces the same challenges that destroyed its ancient predecessor. Political authorities try to censor or control information. Religious extremists attack ideas they find threatening. Corporate interests prioritize profit over preservation. And the very technologies that make universal access possible also make universal destruction easier than ever before. The difference is that we know what we're building now. We understand the stakes. We've seen what happens when knowledge is allowed to vanish, and we've experienced the power of information freely shared. We have the opportunity to learn from Alexandria's mistakes while fulfilling its promise. But the most important legacy of the Library of Alexandria isn't technological, it's philosophical. The idea that knowledge belongs to all humanity, that truth transcends cultural and political boundaries, that understanding is worth pursuing for its own sake. These concepts, born in Alexandria over 2 millennia ago, remain revolutionary today. In a world divided by nationalism, religious conflict, and political polarization, the Alexandrian vision offers an alternative, a community of minds dedicated to understanding rather than controlling, to learning rather than conquering, to preserving rather than destroying. Every time a scholar shares research freely online, every time a librarian helps someone find information, every time a teacher encourages students to question and explore, the spirit of Alexandria lives on. Every Wikipedia entry, every open access journal, every digitized manuscript represents a small victory for the dream that died in the flames of ancient fanaticism. The Library of Alexandria was destroyed by people who feared knowledge, who believed that truth was dangerous, who thought that learning should serve only their particular interests, but they couldn't destroy the idea itself. That proved stronger than fire, more enduring than bronze, more persistent than time itself. Today, as we build our digital Alexandria, we face the same choice that confronted every generation since the original library's destruction. Will we choose openness or control? Will we fear knowledge or embrace it? Will we build walls around information or tear them down? The ghost of Alexandria haunts these questions. The dream of universal knowledge born on the shores of the Mediterranean when the world was young still whispers to us across the centuries. It reminds us that knowledge is humanity's greatest treasure, that understanding is our highest calling, and that the light of learning, once kindled, can never truly be extinguished. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but Alexandria itself, the idea, the vision, the impossible dream of gathering all human knowledge under one roof, lives on. It lives in every library, every school, every act of learning and teaching and sharing. It lives in us. And as long as human beings remain curious about their world, as long as we continue to ask questions and seek answers, as long as we believe that knowledge should be preserved rather than destroyed, the Library of Alexandria will never truly die. The books are gone, the scrolls are ash, the building is dust, but the dream burns on, eternal and inextinguishable, lighting the way toward a future where all human knowledge might finally, truly belong to all humanity. That was the promise of Alexandria. That remains our promise today. Did Marco Polo actually make it to China? The man who supposedly spent 17 years in the court of Kublai Khan travelled the Silk Road and brought back tales of wonder that changed Europe forever. But here's the thing, there's a growing chorus of historians who think it's all bullshit. That the most famous traveller in history might have been sitting in a Constantinople tavern, making up stories about chopsticks and fireworks. Before we unpack this historical whodunit, take a moment to like the video if you're enjoying the deep dive, and don't forget to subscribe for more investigations into history's greatest mysteries. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see our global community come together for these controversial topics. Now settle in, maybe grab a cup of tea, ironically something Marco claimed to have discovered in China, and let's examine whether the man who put the Far East on Europe's mental map ever actually left the Middle East. Because by the time we're done tonight, you might never look at that childhood geography lesson the same way again. This isn't just about one man's travels. This is about how legends are born, how history gets written, and what happens when the most famous travel story ever told might be the most famous travel lie ever sold. Let's start with what we think we know about Marco Polo. Born in Venice around 1254 to a family of merchants who had already dipped their toes in Eastern trade. His father Niccolo and uncle Maffeo had supposedly made an earlier journey to China, met Kublai Khan himself, and been given letters to take back to the Pope. Classic medieval power politics. The Mongol emperor wanted to establish diplomatic relations with Christian Europe. When they returned to Venice in 1269, young Marco was about 15 years old, and according to the story, in 1271, all three Polos set off together for China. The journey would take them across the treacherous Silk Road, through Persia, across the Gobi Desert, and into the court of the most powerful ruler on earth. Marco supposedly spent the next 17 years in China, serving as an administrator for Kublai Khan, travelling to Burma, India, and all corners of the vast Mongol Empire. He learned languages, observed customs, and collected the stories that would later become Il Milione, the travels of Marco Polo. The tale goes that in 1292, the Polos were finally allowed to leave China, escorting a Mongol princess to Persia by sea. They arrived back in Venice in 1295, after 24 years away, supposedly laden with riches and incredible stories. Marco then dictated his adventures to a romance writer named Rustichello while they were both imprisoned in Genoa after a naval battle between Venice and Genoa. It's a hell of a story. Adventure, exotic lands, imperial courts, wealth beyond imagination. The kind of tale that captures imaginations and launches 1,000 ships. And that might be exactly what it was, a tale. Because when you start examining the details, things get weird fast. The travels of Marco Polo wasn't just popular, it was revolutionary. For medieval Europeans, it was their first detailed glimpse of a world they never knew existed. Marco described things that sounded like pure fantasy. Black stones that burned, coal, money made of paper, a postal system that spanned continents, cities larger than anything in Europe. He wrote about the Khan's palace with walls covered in silver and gold, about cities where 1 million people lived, about spices and silks and technologies that seemed impossible. To Europeans still living in the shadow of the Dark Ages, it was like reading science fiction. The book became an instant sensation. It was copied by hand, translated into multiple languages, and spread across Europe like wildfire. Christopher Columbus carried a copy on his voyages. It inspired countless explorers and merchants. It literally put China on the European map. Many of the place names Marco used were adopted by cartographers and remained standard for centuries. But here's where it gets interesting. Even from the beginning, people were skeptical. Marco's contemporaries nicknamed the book Il Milione, not just because of the vast numbers he described, but because they thought he was telling 1,000,000 lies. Venice was full of merchants who had traded in the eastern Mediterranean and Constantinople, and many of them whispered that Marco's stories sounded suspiciously like the tales told in Middle Eastern markets. The book was compelling, sure, but was it true? Or was Marco Polo the medieval equivalent of a travel blogger who photoshopped all his Instagram posts? Because when modern historians started fact-checking Marco's manuscript against what we actually know about 13th century China, they found some glaring problems. Here's where Marco Polo's story starts to unravel like a cheap rug. If you spend 17 years in China, especially 17 years working for the emperor, you're going to notice some pretty basic things about Chinese culture. Things so fundamental that leaving them out of your travel memoir would be like writing about New York without mentioning skyscrapers. Let's start with the big one, the Great Wall of China. Now, Marco didn't have to describe the wall as we know it today. The version tourists visit was largely built during the Ming Dynasty, but there were extensive fortifications and walls across northern China during the Yuan Dynasty, when Marco supposedly lived there. These weren't invisible, they were massive construction projects that any traveller, let alone a government administrator, would have encountered. Marco Polo never mentions them, not once. Then there's tea. Tea wasn't just popular in 13th century China, it was ubiquitous. It was the national drink, a cornerstone of Chinese culture, something that every visitor would encounter daily. Marco describes Chinese dining customs, Chinese agriculture, Chinese trade goods, but he never mentions tea. In a book filled with observations about exotic foods and drinks, he somehow missed the one beverage that defined Chinese civilization: chopsticks. Again, not exactly a subtle cultural practice. If you're eating with Chinese officials, travelling with Chinese companions, or living in Chinese cities for nearly 2 decades, you're going to encounter chopsticks. They're not hidden. They're on every table, in every restaurant, part of every meal. Marco Polo describes Chinese food, Chinese banquets, Chinese dining etiquette, no chopsticks, Chinese characters. Marco mentions Chinese writing, but his descriptions are vague and often inaccurate. For someone who supposedly learned to read and write Chinese well enough to serve as an imperial administrator, he shows a remarkable lack of understanding of how Chinese writing actually works. Foot binding. This practice was widespread among upper-class Chinese women during the Song and Yuan dynasties. It wasn't hidden or secret, it was a visible marker of status and beauty. Marco describes Chinese women, Chinese fashion, Chinese social customs, but he never mentions foot binding, something that would have been immediately obvious to any foreign visitor. And here's the kicker: Chinese historical records. The Chinese were meticulous record keepers. They documented court appointments, foreign visitors, diplomatic missions, administrative positions. If a Venetian merchant had spent 17 years serving Kublai Khan in important positions, as Marco claimed, there would be Chinese records of it. There aren't. No Chinese source from the period mentions Marco Polo, his father, or his uncle. Not one. So if Marco Polo didn't go to China, how did he write such a convincing book about it? Well, let's look at what he actually described versus what he conveniently left out, because the pattern tells a fascinating story. Marco's book is incredibly detailed about the Middle East, Central Asia, and the western portions of the Mongol Empire. His descriptions of Persia, Armenia, and the trade routes through Central Asia are accurate, specific, and match other contemporary sources. He knows the terrain, the politics, the local customs. This stuff is solid. But the farther east his story goes, the vaguer it becomes. His descriptions of China often read like summaries of other people's accounts rather than personal observations. He describes the size of cities, but not their specific layouts. He mentions the wealth of the Khan, but provides few concrete details about court life. He talks about Chinese customs, but in broad, general terms that could have been gleaned from any number of second-hand sources. Here's the really interesting part. Most of what Marco describes about China could have been learned in Constantinople or other major trading centres in the eastern Mediterranean. The Byzantine Empire and various Muslim states had extensive trade relationships with China. Chinese goods flowed west, and with them came stories, descriptions, and cultural details. Constantinople in the 13th century was a cosmopolitan hub, where merchants from all over the known world gathered to trade. You could meet Chinese diplomats, Persian merchants, Arab travellers, and European crusaders, all in the same market. You could see Chinese silk, taste Chinese spices, and hear detailed stories about Chinese cities without ever leaving the Mediterranean. And that's exactly what Marco's descriptions sound like. The carefully gathered second-hand accounts of someone who spent years talking to traders and travellers in the bazaars of the Middle East. Accurate enough to be convincing, but lacking the specific, personal details you'd expect from someone who actually lived there. Marco Polo wasn't necessarily lying. He might have genuinely believed his book was accurate. But there's a difference between careful research and personal experience. And the more scholars examine his account, the more it looks like brilliant medieval journalism rather than authentic travel memoir. Let's get forensic about this. When historians want to verify historical claims, they look for corroboration. Multiple sources that confirm the same events, people, or details. With Marco Polo, the opposite happens. The more we know about 13th century China, the more obvious his omissions become. Take Chinese currency. Marco famously described paper money, which was revolutionary news to Europeans who still use gold and silver coins. His description of how paper currency worked was accurate and impressive, but he describes it in general terms, how the system worked in principle, not the specific denominations, designs, or administrative details you'd know if you'd actually handled it regularly. Compare this to his descriptions of Middle Eastern coinage, which are precise, specific, and show intimate familiarity with exchange rates, metal content, and regional variations. The difference is stark, Then there's the language issue. Marco supposedly spent 17 years in China and served as an administrator. This would require substantial fluency in Chinese, Mongolian, or Persian, the administrative languages of the Yuan court. Yet his book shows minimal understanding of Chinese language structure, and the Chinese terms he does use are often mangled or inaccurate. More damning is what Chinese sources don't say. The Yuan dynasty kept extensive records. Foreign visitors, especially ones serving in government positions, were documented. We have records of other Europeans who visited China during this period, missionaries, diplomats, and traders. Their visits are noted in Chinese sources. Marco Polo, despite supposedly holding important positions and travelling extensively on official business, appears in no Chinese records whatsoever. Not in court documents, not in administrative records, not in the detailed chronicles that Chinese historians kept of foreign relations. This isn't an argument from silence, it's an argument from very loud silence. If Marco had done what he claimed, there would be traces. The fact that there aren't any suggests he wasn't there to leave them. Archaeological evidence also poses problems. Marco describes specific buildings, cities, and landmarks. As archaeologists have excavated sites across China, they found that many of Marco's descriptions don't match the physical evidence. Buildings he claims to have seen hadn't been built yet, or had been destroyed before his supposed visit. Even the timeline doesn't work perfectly. Marco places himself in certain locations at specific times, but cross-referencing with other sources shows some of these claims are impossible. He would have had to be in two places at once, or arrive at cities before they existed, or witness events that happened decades apart. Individually, any of these issues could be explained away: memory errors, translation problems, scribal mistakes. But taken together, they paint a picture of someone reconstructing a journey from second-hand sources rather than recording personal experiences. But before we declare Marco Polo a fraud, let's look at the evidence in his favour. Because despite all the problems with his account, there are compelling reasons why many historians still think he made the journey, even if his book isn't entirely reliable. First, the sheer scope and accuracy of many details. Marco's descriptions of Mongol administration, trade routes, and political structures are remarkably accurate. His understanding of how the Yuan dynasty governed its vast territories shows sophisticated knowledge that would have been difficult to fake. The political intrigue, the administrative challenges, the relationships between different parts of the empire, this stuff rings true. His descriptions of cities along the Silk Road are often corroborated by other sources. Places like Kashgar, Samarkand, and Bukhara are described with a kind of specific detail that suggests personal familiarity. The routes he claims to have taken match the actual trade routes used during the period. The timing of his journey corresponds with a period when the Silk Road was relatively safe and well travelled. Marco also describes technologies and customs that weren't widely known in Europe but were accurate to Chinese practice. His accounts of paper money, postal systems, and coal use were considered fantastical by medieval Europeans, but have proven to be accurate descriptions of Chinese innovations. Some historians argue that the omissions in his account can be explained by the circumstances of its composition. Marco dictated his story to Rustichello, a writer of popular romances, while they were both in prison. Rustichello may have edited out details he thought would bore readers, or focused on elements that would appeal to European audiences hungry for tales of wealth and exoticism. The book was meant to be entertaining, not an ethnographic study. Marco might have skipped over everyday details like chopsticks and tea because they weren't exciting enough for his intended audience. Europeans wanted to hear about gold and jewels, not dining etiquette. There's also the family business to consider. The Polo family were merchants, and their business depended on trade routes between Europe and Asia. If they had never actually established connections in China, how did they maintain their wealth and reputation as Eastern traders for generations after Marco's return. Archaeological evidence, while sometimes contradicting Marco's account, has also confirmed some of his descriptions. Excavations have revealed that some cities he described do match the archaeological record, and some buildings he mentioned have been identified by researchers. Finally, there's the question of motive. If Marco never went to China, why create such an elaborate fake story? The risks were enormous. His reputation, his family's business, his entire social standing depended on the credibility of his account. In Venice, where merchants lived or died by their reputation for reliability, fabricating such a massive lie seems almost suicidal. Maybe the truth, as it often is, lies somewhere in the middle. A growing number of historians propose a compromise theory. Marco Polo did travel east, but probably not as far as he claimed. He may have gotten as far as Central Asia, spent time in the major trading cities along the Silk Road, and gathered extensive second-hand information about China without actually reaching it. This theory explains both the strengths and weaknesses of his account. The accurate descriptions of Central Asian cities, trade routes, and Mongol administration could come from personal experience. The problematic descriptions of China could be based on careful interviewing of Chinese merchants, diplomats, and travellers he met in places like Kashgar or Samarkand. In the 13th century, these Central Asian trading hubs were incredibly cosmopolitan. You could spend months in a city like Bukhara meeting people from every corner of the known world. Chinese officials travelled these routes regularly. Persian merchants carried goods between China and the Mediterranean. Arab travellers brought back detailed accounts of Chinese cities and customs. A clever, curious merchant could easily have assembled enough information to write a convincing account of China without ever seeing the Great Wall, especially if that merchant spent years in these trading centres, asking questions, taking notes, and piecing together a comprehensive picture from dozens of different sources. This would also explain why Marco's account is so strong on administrative and commercial details, the kind of information that would interest merchants, and so weak on cultural minutiae that wouldn't typically come up in business conversations. The timeline supports this theory too. Marco's claimed 17 years in China might have been 17 years in Central Asia, with periodic visits to Chinese communities, but never reaching the heartland of China itself. The wealth he supposedly brought back could have come from successful trading in these intermediate markets rather than direct access to Chinese sources. It would also explain the family's continued success in Eastern trade. They had established genuine business relationships and geographical knowledge, even if they had somewhat exaggerated the extent of their travels for marketing purposes. Think of it as medieval trade credibility. Saying you had been to Central Asia was impressive but not unique. Lots of merchants made it that far. But claiming to have reached China and served the Khan himself, that would set you apart from every competitor, give you unmatched credibility, and justify premium prices for your exotic goods. Here's where the Marco Polo story gets really interesting from a business perspective. Forget whether he actually reached China. Let's talk about what his book accomplished for the Polo family brand. The Travels of Marco Polo wasn't just a travel memoir. It was the most successful piece of trade marketing in medieval history. The book established the Polos as the ultimate experts on Eastern trade, the go-to family for exotic goods and geographical knowledge. It was basically a 300-page advertisement that said, "Trust us, we've been there." In the competitive world of Venetian commerce, credibility was everything. Merchants who could claim direct access to Asian sources commanded premium prices. They could negotiate better deals, attract wealthier clients, and justify higher markups. Marco's book was like having a Harvard MBA and references from Fortune 500 CEOs, except for medieval trade, and the timing was perfect. Europe was hungry for Eastern goods, silk, spices, precious stones, exotic technologies, but the routes were dangerous, the distances enormous, and reliable information scarce. Anyone who could claim insider knowledge of Asian markets had a massive competitive advantage. The book's popularity also had a multiplier effect. Every copy sold enhanced the Polo family's reputation. Every reader who shared the stories reinforced their credentials. Every reference by other writers or mapmakers further established them as authorities. It was viral marketing before viruses existed. But here's the genius part. Even if the book was partially fictional, it still accomplished its marketing goals. Medieval readers had no way to fact-check claims about Chinese customs or Mongolian politics. They could only judge the book by how convincing it sounded and how much it impressed them. And it did impress them. The book was so successful that other merchant families started commissioning their own travel accounts. The market for exotic travel literature exploded, with dozens of competing books claiming to reveal the secrets of Eastern lands. Marco Polo didn't just potentially fake a journey, he created an entire literary genre. He turned travel writing into a business tool and personal branding into a family fortune. Whether he actually reached China becomes almost secondary to the economic and cultural impact of his claims. The real question isn't whether Marco Polo was a liar, it's whether he was a genius. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence against Marco Polo's Chinese adventure comes from linguistics, specifically what his book reveals about his knowledge of Chinese languages and culture through the words he uses and doesn't use. Language is hard to fake. If you spend 17 years in a country, especially in an administrative capacity, you don't just pick up vocabulary, you absorb the rhythm, structure, and cultural nuances of the language. Your foreign language mistakes become very specific and telltale. Native speakers can usually identify not just that you're foreign, but where you learned their language and how long you've been speaking it. Marco's book contains Chinese words and place names, but they're problematic. Many are mangled, transliterated through multiple languages, or show misunderstanding of Chinese grammar and pronunciation. This could indicate he learned Chinese terms second-hand, possibly through Persian or Arabic intermediaries who were themselves working from Chinese sources. More tellingly, the Chinese terms Marco uses are often the ones that would have been most commonly known to international traders. Names of major cities, basic trade goods, administrative titles that appeared in diplomatic correspondence. They're exactly the words you'd pick up from merchant conversations without actually living in the country. Compare this to his use of Persian and Arabic terms, which are more numerous, more accurate, and show deeper cultural understanding. His descriptions of Middle Eastern customs use precise terminology that suggests real familiarity. When he talks about Islamic religious practices, Persian court ceremonies, or Arabic commercial customs, the language is confident and specific. The Mongolian terms in his account are also more reliable than the Chinese ones. Since the Yuan dynasty was ruled by Mongols, you might expect Marco to know more Mongolian than Chinese. But even here, his usage suggests formal diplomatic contact rather than daily conversation. Perhaps most significantly, Marco doesn't demonstrate understanding of Chinese writing systems. He mentions Chinese writing, but describes it in vague terms that could apply to any ideographic system. For someone who supposedly served as an administrator and travelled extensively with official documents, this lack of specific knowledge about Chinese characters is suspicious. The linguistic evidence suggests someone who had extensive contact with the Eastern trade networks, but probably conducted that business in Persian, Arabic, or Mongolian rather than Chinese. These were the lingua francas of Silk Road commerce. You could trade successfully across Central Asia without speaking Chinese, especially if your contacts were Mongol administrators rather than Chinese civilians. To really understand whether Marco Polo fabricated his journey, we need to understand the psychological and cultural context of medieval travel writing. This wasn't an age of scientific accuracy or journalistic integrity. Travel books were expected to be entertaining, inspirational, and commercially useful. Truth was less important than impact. Medieval travel literature followed established conventions. Travellers were expected to encounter marvels, meet exotic peoples, and return with incredible stories. The more amazing your tales, the more successful your book. Marco was competing in a literary marketplace that rewarded exaggeration and punished modesty. Consider the alternatives available to Marco. If he had travelled only to Central Asia and written an honest account of reaching, say, Kashgar, his book would have been forgotten. Plenty of merchants made it that far. But claiming to have reached the court of the great Khan himself, that was unprecedented. That was a bestseller material. The psychology of memory also matters. If Marco did travel extensively in Central Asia and spent years collecting stories about China, by the time he dictated his book decades later, the line between personal experience and gathered intelligence might have blurred in his own mind. Memory is reconstructive. We remember what we think happened, not necessarily what actually happened. Marco was also dictating to Rustichello, a writer of popular romances. Rusticello's job was to make the story entertaining and marketable. He would have encouraged dramatic elements, downplayed boring details, and shaped the narrative to fit medieval literary expectations. The book we have might be as much Rusticello's creation as Marco's. There's also the prison context to consider. Marco and Rusticello were both captives, with nothing to do but tell stories. In that environment, tales grow in the telling. Details get elaborated. Adventures become more adventurous. What might have started as accurate accounts could have been polished into something more dramatic over months of retelling. Finally, we have to consider what truth meant in medieval culture. Modern readers expect factual accuracy, but medieval audiences were more comfortable with allegorical or symbolic truth. A story didn't have to be literally accurate to be considered true if it conveyed important insights about the world. Marco Polo might not have been trying to deceive anyone. He might have genuinely believed his book represented the truth about China, even if that truth was assembled from multiple sources rather than personal experience. So where do we stand? After decades of scholarly debate, analysis of Chinese sources, archaeological investigation, and linguistic analysis, what's the current academic consensus on Marco Polo? The answer is, there isn't one. The scholarly community remains deeply divided, but the divisions are more nuanced than simple believers versus skeptics. Most historians now fall into one of several camps. The traditionalists still argue that Marco made the journey essentially as described, though they acknowledge the book contains errors and embellishments. They point to the accurate details about Mongol administration and the family's continued success in Eastern trade as evidence of genuine Chinese connections. The skeptics argue that Marco never got beyond Central Asia, and that his descriptions of China are too vague and inaccurate to represent personal experience. They emphasize the linguistic problems, the absence from Chinese records, and the crucial omissions in his account. The compromisers suggest Marco reached some parts of the Mongol Empire, but probably not China proper. They see the book as a mixture of personal experience and second-hand information, with the balance shifting towards second-hand sources for the more distant locations. A new group of scholars focuses less on the truth of Marco's claims and more on the cultural impact of his book. They argue that whether he actually reached China is less important than how his book shaped European understanding of Asia and influenced subsequent exploration and trade. Recent archaeological discoveries have both supported and undermined different aspects of Marco's account. Some cities he described have been excavated and found to match his descriptions. Others have revealed anachronisms or impossibilities. The physical evidence is mixed. Chinese scholarship has generally been skeptical of Marco's claims, partly because of the absence of Chinese records, but also because of cultural details that suggest superficial knowledge rather than deep familiarity. The most honest answer is that we may never know for certain. Medieval travel books are notoriously unreliable historical sources. The standards of evidence and accuracy we expect today simply didn't exist in the 13th century. Marco Polo's book was successful precisely because it wasn't constrained by modern standards of factual accuracy. What we can say is that Marco Polo's influence on history was real regardless of whether his journey was. His book inspired Columbus, influenced cartographers, and shaped European understanding of Asia for centuries. Sometimes the legend becomes more important than the truth. Whether Marco Polo actually reached China might be the wrong question. The right question might be, does it matter? Marco Polo's book changed history. It opened European minds to the possibility of a wider world, filled with technologies, cultures, and opportunities beyond their imagination. It helped launch the age of exploration, influenced trade routes, and contributed to the intellectual ferment that would eventually become the Renaissance. Columbus carried Marco's book with him to the New World. Portuguese explorers used his descriptions to plan their routes to Asia. Venetian merchants built fortunes on the trade routes he popularized. Even if his personal journey was partially fictional, its historical impact was entirely real. The book also represents something deeper about human nature and the power of storytelling. We want to believe in great adventures, in individuals who dare to venture into the unknown and return with tales of wonder. Marco Polo gave medieval Europe exactly the kind of story it needed. A tale of courage, discovery, and impossible journeys made real. Maybe that's enough. Maybe the truth of Marco Polo lies not in whether he personally saw the Great Wall or tasted Chinese tea, but in his ability to expand human horizons through the power of narrative. He might not have been the greatest traveller in history, but he might have been its greatest travel writer. The controversy over his journey has also taught us valuable lessons about historical evidence and the reliability of sources. The scholarly debate around Marco Polo has refined our methods for analysing medieval texts, understanding the difference between personal observation and second-hand reporting, and recognising the cultural biases that shape all historical accounts. In the end, Marco Polo represents the eternal human desire to explore, to discover, to push beyond the boundaries of the known world. Whether he actually did what he claimed is less important than the fact that his story inspired countless others to try. The journey might have been fake, but the inspiration was real. And sometimes, in the strange accounting of history, that's what matters most. So here we are, after examining the evidence, weighing the arguments, and considering the alternatives. Did Marco Polo reach China? The honest answer is, probably not in the way he claimed. The evidence suggests a journey that ended in Central Asia, supplemented by extensive second-hand research about Chinese culture and politics. But does that make him a fraud? That depends on what we expect from medieval travel literature and how we define truth in historical context. Marco Polo gave Europe something it desperately needed, a window into a wider world, a sense of possibility beyond the narrow confines of medieval European experience. His book wasn't just a travel account, it was an act of imagination that helped reshape European consciousness. It challenged assumptions about geography, culture, and the limits of human achievement. Whether those challenges were based on personal experience or carefully researched fiction might be less important than their historical impact. The debate over Marco Polo also reveals something about our own relationship with truth and storytelling. We want our heroes to be authentic, our adventures to be real, our inspirations to be genuine. When we discover that a legendary figure might have embellished or fabricated their achievements, we feel betrayed. But maybe we're asking the wrong questions. Instead of demanding perfect factual accuracy from a 13th century travel book, maybe we should appreciate its achievement as a work of imagination, research, and cultural bridge building. Marco Polo created something that hadn't existed before, a comprehensive, compelling vision of Asian civilization that would influence European thinking for centuries. He might not have been the greatest traveller in history, but he was certainly one of history's most influential storytellers. And in the end, the stories we tell about the world might be more important than the literal truth of our personal experiences within it. The legend of Marco Polo will probably outlive all scholarly debates about its accuracy. Because legends serve a different purpose than history, they inspire, they motivate, they expand our sense of what's possible. Whether Marco Polo actually reached China matters to historians. Whether his story continues to inspire explorers, writers, and dreamers matters to all of us. Maybe that's the most important truth of all. Sometimes the journey that never happened can change the world more than the ones that did.